is his party, but it's not his. Good morning, students and guests. Students, as you come in, feel free to just grab a seat. We'd like to get started as soon as possible. So whether it's advisor or by class or with your friend, you're just going to be well behaved regardless of where you are. Have a seat. Students, just find a seat wherever you are. We're starting in 1 minute. Have a seat. Doesn't matter where you is. Good morning. Could I have your attention, please? For the next probably 5 minutes, we will have guests, students, and otherwise probably filtering in and taking in these last seats. They're going to come in quietly. But we're going to get started. I'd like to welcome you to what is actually the first meeting for this election campaign in this riding of the all the candidates for the federal election. So I'm just going to give you a couple sort of hi, how are yous? I'm going to give you a couple facts and details. The plan is to then introduce each of the candidates. You're going to clap at the end of all four. This is not a political rally. This is an exercise in civil discourse. So there's being no rah-rahing from the crowd, please. We're then going to go straight into 8 preset questions, which will be read by students. I hope you're all ready. If not, I've got them here and can fill in, to be answered in order by various candidates to whom they're directed. And then the floor will be opened at about 11:30. And there are microphones on the left and the right, down on the main floor, for people to ask questions as they see fit. We would ask that questions last no longer than 30 seconds, and that you have, candidates, a minute approximately to answer them. I will be vigilant with the timer so that we can stay to time. Follow-up questions are allowed once, which is to say, if, as a questioner, you don't get the answer that you were looking for, or you feel you phrased it poorly, you may get one more chance, if you ask nicely by just raising your hand, to redirect, at which point the candidate will do a better job, hopefully, in understanding your question and giving you a better answer. Okay? Okay, so this riding is one of many across the nation. The traditional definition of a riding is how long it took for a horse to gallop across a day, and that was considered a reasonable amount of land space to have representation in the government all the way over in Ottawa. We're the second largest nation in the world and a fairly small population, and so this was quite important to determine properly. Our riding is about 5,000 kilometers squared. It runs from Lake Cowichan, way up in the north, heading south down through Duncan, down through Mill Bay, Shawnigan, Cobble Hill, over the Malahat and down into Langford, which is sort of the outskirts of Victoria. Very different peoples live in each of those places, different by socioeconomics, different by interests and everything else. And the poor person who has to come and represent them in Ottawa, all those individual concerns, actually has quite a job ahead of them. These 4 are nuts. More to the point, they have until October 21st to convince everyone in that 5,000 square kilometer riding that they're the one to vote for, which means it's especially special that they would show up to a school of all places and spend some time with you, educating as to how this process works, answering questions that you might have as teens, even knowing that more than half of you are not voting in this election. That's a really, really generous gift on their part, and I'd like you to join your hands together and thank them as a whole. Just so you're aware, students, we also have guests from the local area filtered in and amongst you, so you're on your best behavior. If you feel sleepy, get out the toothpicks. I'm just kidding. So, starting in order, just nearest me, we have Mr. Blair Herbert, representing the Liberal candidate for this riding. Don't clap. Secondly, we have Mr. Alistair McGregor. He's our incumbent NDP candidate for this riding. Thirdly, we have Lydia Whitson, who's the Green candidate for this riding. And finally, we have Alana DeLong, who's the Conservative candidate for this riding. Now you can join your hands together. We would ask the candidates to introduce themselves as they know best. We're going to give them 3 minutes, give or take a second or two in each case, to talk about who they are, the affiliation with the party, what you need to know as potential voters and actual voters to make your decision. And we'd like to start in that same order. Mr. Blair Herbert, if you would go ahead.
Okay. Well, first of all, we're going to need a really fast horse to get across this riding in a day. That's for sure. It's huge. Okay. That didn't work. How's this?
Better.
There we go. All right. We're going to need a very fast horse to get across this riding in a day. It's a huge riding. It also goes out to all the way to the west side of the island in Port Renfrew. So it's very, very large, and it's demographically different because we have Langford is average age population is about 20 years younger than it is in Duncan. So it's interesting. I'm happy to see all the students here today engaging in the political process. Just to give you some history, I got interested in politics when I was 13 years old, and I did a school project for, I guess it would have been my grade 8 class, and I interviewed a member of parliament in Edmonton, and I was hooked. I thought this was an interesting occupation, and I would strive for it. It took me another 50 years, but here I am. I'm looking forward to representing Cowichan, Malahat, Langford in Ottawa. Personally, I live in Mill Bay here. I have a farm just north of town. We're an organic farm. We plant lots of organic garlic. We raise chickens. We have bees, all that sort of thing, and we have a very nice life, as I believe most people do in Cowichan. I'm also, for the last 35 years, I've been a small business person in the real estate and construction business. Prior to that, I was an RCMP officer. I was an immigration officer when we were settling refugees in this country back in the late 70s from the Vietnam War. And I was also an investigator for the Provincial Ombudsman's Office, which is, as you probably know, is sort of the complaint department for the provincial government. My reason for getting into this election is the environment and the economy. I think both of those things go hand in hand, and I think they are very important. My belief is that 80% of the people in this riding, especially the northern part of the riding, believe that the environment is sort of the #1 issue. And I want to be able to help move that file forward and actually accomplish more in the next 4 years. In the last 4 years, we came out, in 2018, actually the Liberal government came out with a climate plan. It's a $70 billion plan over a period of 10 years. It's the carbon tax that seems to get the majority of the news coverage. But there are lots of other things in there, as in infrastructure for high-speed transit, that sort of thing, that throws a lot of money into those things and would in effect help the government. That's about all I have to say for now. It's going to be an interesting evening. I'm very new at this, but I'm a quick learner, so we'll see what happens. Thanks.
Absolutely perfect timing, 2 minutes, 48 seconds. For reasons that I'll explain shortly, I'd like to switch to the other end of the table and invite Alana DeLong to give her 3 minutes introduction. Go ahead, Alana.
Well, thank you, and good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Alana DeLong, and I'm the Conservative Party candidate. I grew up in BC, went to junior high in Colwood, high school in Victoria, BSc Honours Math at UBC, and then off to work in Alberta in the computer industry for 20 years, followed by 14 years as the MLA for Calgary-Bow. My BC education gave me an abiding belief in democracy. I believe that government should be guided and controlled by the people through the elected representatives. And that's why I knocked on every door in Calgary-Bow before every election. That's why, though I'm now 71 years old, I've already knocked on more than 7,000 doors here in this riding to hear from each of you. How else can anyone claim to represent the people if you've not actually listened to them? I also believe that there is no such thing as government money. Every nickel belongs to the people of Canada and should be spent respectfully and respecting how hard Canadians had to work to earn it for the government to be able to spend. And Canadians do work hard, But of late, we've been working harder and not getting ahead. Too much of our hard-earned money is being taken by government. A few days ago, I knocked on the door of a 67-year-old woman who had worked hard all her life, but who now had a heart condition that prevented her from working. Her income was $11,000 a year, and the tax man wanted an additional $700. We were both in tears by the end of the visit. Unacceptable. Budgets do not balance themselves. Any government department can come up with enough spending ideas to double their budgets. It takes hard work, careful analysis, and perseverance by an elected representative just to hold back the government from reaching deeper and deeper into your pockets. Let alone having a prime minister handing out $12 million of your money to his billionaire friends at Loblaws, and $256 million to the Asian Infrastructure Bank to build roads and bridges overseas, but no, not here in Canada. And how about the $155,000 for one red leather couch? As Ralph Klein used to say, what would Martha and Henry think about that? Well, what do you think about that? Is that really how you want your money spent? What we, the Conservatives, will do, we will leave more money in your pocket for you, for your kids, for your parents. We will take GST off your home heating. We will scrap the carbon tax. We will make parental benefits tax-free. We will lower personal taxes.
10 seconds.
We will balance the budget, and we will attract better, higher-paying jobs. Why? Because it's time for you to get ahead. Thank you.
That was 10 seconds over. 5 points off Gryffindor. We'll now invite Lydia Whitson from the Green Party to give her 3 minutes.
Good morning. Aitnetat. My name is Lydia Whitson. My traditional name is Lilia. I'm from the Cowichan people, and I've resided here my whole life in the Cowichan Valley. I'm so pleased to be here. I'm pleased to recognize the Malahat people. Metlachas is the way you pronounce it. Malahat's the anglicized version, but recognize them because this is their ancestral lands, and we're happy to be here on them. I'm thankful for the presence of each and every one of you. This is an exciting opportunity to address a crowd of young people and be able to hear from you and your questions. I've spent over 20 years advocating and actively supporting human rights, Indigenous rights, social justice, and ecological justice. Whether it's the work that I've done locally, creating the Cowichan Watershed Board 10 years ago, bringing diverse and multiple jurisdictions around the table to make decisions in the best interest of our watershed, to bring a whole of watershed thinking forward. The point is to bring people around the table and recognize that when we work together and collaborate, there's so much opportunity for success. For 10 years, the Cowichan Watershed Board has done excellent work in terms of habitat restoration, has been critical in advocating for the money necessary for adjusting the work we need to do on the weir with respect to the Lake Cowichan and our river. Whether it's the presentations I've made at the Organization of American States, at the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights advocating, or at the United Nations. The work provincially that I've done most recently is around the necessary work to implement UNDRIP principles into provincial legislation. So the BC Environmental Assessment Act was recently amended at the end of last year based on a report that I was able to co-draft recommending changes to the process to ensure that Indigenous rights are recognized and that free, prior, informed consent is achievable. Part of my approach definitely that I bring is I really want to keep in context that we need to think about the love that we need in this world to survive. We need to think about the understanding that we need to bring in order to find those collaborative way forwards, to find answers that we're looking for. A collaborative, positive, solution-driven approach helps us find answers. We Didn't even know were there before. So I've led multi-party, multilateral tables that have led to positive change. My values, my integrity, and my preference for kindness is really an underpinning for the way I go forward, whether it's through my law degree or the emotional intelligence that's necessary to recognize that we all need to work together as human beings.
10 seconds.
This is what I bring to the Green Party. This is what I can bring to Parliament. And I lift my hands up to you, and I really look forward to what you have to bring to Canadian society in the future.
And finally, and this is the reason why the order went this way, contrary to how they're seated, I would like to ask Mr. Alistair McGregor to speak. The reason he gets the last word in this introduction phase is because he's the guy who's had the job since 2015. He's the MP for this riding, incumbent, and he's running again. Nuts. Go ahead.
Thank you very much. I would also like to acknowledge that we're meeting here today on the traditional and unceded territory of the Malahat Nation. For the last 4 years, it has been my deep honor and privilege to represent this amazing riding and its constituents in Ottawa. And this job has never, ever been about me. It's been about the amazing people who make their home here. I have also been fortunate to call this amazing region my home for close to 30 years now. I went to school here, and my wife and I now have a small farming property in North Cowichan where we're raising our 3 girls. And what's always struck me about this place, no matter the kind of cynicism you see in Ottawa, the kind of attacks you see in the House of Commons, what's always lifted me up is the kindness and decency that abounds in this area. The people who live here have always lifted me up. They've always encouraged me. They've always given me that strength to keep on going, because my job as a member of Parliament has been to take that local expertise and knowledge and maybe to add to it in some way to make sure that those voices have a proper vetting in Ottawa, that those ideas get the national limelight that they deserve. You know, I got involved in politics a number of years ago when I had the fortune of working for our former Member of Parliament, Jean Crowder. I spent 7 years in her office working as a constituency assistant, and I guess it was during that time that I really got to see the problems up close that are affecting our community. You know, in a country as wealthy as Canada is, I was sitting across the table from pensioners, young families, who were honestly wondering how they were going to make it to the end of the month, whether they were going to have to cut back on good quality food or save that money to actually make the rent and utility bill payments. And it's those kind of stories that kind of lit a small fire inside me. They gave me a purpose to continue going, so that even when Jean announced her retirement, I felt like I wasn't ready to quite quit, because those stories stayed with me. I think in this election, we have to look at the history of our country, the fact that we have been ruled by successive conservative and liberal governments since Confederation, and yet we still have these problems. I think that we need a new approach, one where we put people before profits, where we recognize the inherent goodness of everyday people and stop the corporate influence that plagues Ottawa. We have to realize that the climate change issue is the defining issue of the 21st century, and our response to it here and now is going to really determine how future generations live their lives. I know my time's running out, but I'd like to explain these in further detail during this debate. All I ask is that I hope I can re-earn your trust that you placed on my shoulders in 2015, and that on October 21st, you are able to send me back to Ottawa to continue this important work. Thank you.
Thank you. We will now move to the next phase of today's meeting, where we have students, hopefully ready and primed, to ask the candidates questions which they've had a couple days to consider and think about. Students, I'd ask that you'd now assemble in front of one or of these 2 microphones in a row, and then ask your question. Please stand and wait while the answer is given, and then at the end you can resume your seat. We are in no particular order, although each question has been designated for a particular candidate, and again, they're ready for that. So who might we have first? Come on down. Speak slowly, too.
Hello. First of all, I'd like to thank all of you for being here. My question is directed towards the Liberal candidate. So what tangible actions is your party willing to take in order to achieve true reconciliation beyond the apologies and promises that we've heard in the past? And more specifically, how can we work to combat the water and healthcare crises that we see right now?
Well, first of all, that's not a question I was expecting. Just to explain really quickly, we had 8 questions that were proposed to us, 2 for me, 2 for everybody else, and this was not one of mine, although I'm perfectly happy to respond to it.
Just so that we can keep it in the actual order, Amelia, I know you wouldn't mind if we actually did direct it to the person that was prepared for the answer. It may be that I made a mistake in some version of document. I believe it was for the Conservative candidate that question was originally intended. That's what I have in notes. Alana, did you have this question
Yes, I did.
in mind?
Yes, I did.
Thanks, Amelia.
My apologies.
So this is the one.
This is the Indigenous reconciliation.
Right, yes. Okay, well, I truly believe that there is no way that we can have lasting reconciliation without economic reconciliation. And that we believe in joining the economic stream is the very best way forward for Indigenous peoples. A great example of this is the Indigenous Consortium Eagle Spirit Energy Holding Company, which has proposed building a pipeline between Alberta and Grassy Point on the northern BC coast. Every Indigenous group along the proposed route is backing the proposal, and this would be an energy corridor carrying oil, gas, hydro lines, and fiber optic cable. It's a $16 billion venture that would bring much in the way of economic benefit to the communities sharing in the project. However, as long as there's a tanker ban in place, the project is stalled. We, the Conservative Party, support the economic growth of Indigenous communities, and it's time we work together to create a positive future for Indigenous communities and youth by increasing economic and educational opportunities.
Thank you.
Great. Who's next? There should be 7 more of you.
This question is for the NDP. What is the plan for your party to work with other parties to come up with a climate action plan in our area?
Thank you for the question. It can be a little bit difficult, I guess, between elections to work with the other parties, but one example I'd like to look at is the Cowichan Leadership Group that was recently formed. It's a leadership group composed of myself, the local MLA, Cowichan Tribes Chief Seymour, the head of the CBRD, and I think a much more effective response to the climate issue and how it's affecting our region is to work with multiple levels of government, understanding that we cannot each operate in our own various silos and tackle this problem effectively. It's going to require a whole range of different levels tackling it appropriately. I think for our specific region, there are some specific solutions like building the ENN railway. That's something I've always supported. But also in adapting to climate change, I was recently pleased to see that the Cowichan Weir got an announcement of $4.5 million for engineering work. That's something I've been lobbying the Liberal government for the past 4 years, and I was glad to see that it finally came to some success.
Thank you. Thanks, Gus. Who's next?
Hello, this is for the Liberal candidate, and thank you all for being here. So my question is, how will the Liberal government increase Canada's presence in its northern regions? And I know that this was already on the Liberal platform in the 2015 election, but I was wondering if there's anything new to be added.
Okay, well, great question. Thanks for asking it. I'm having issues with this. At least this one here I knew I was getting. There's sort of 2 parts to that question, and one of them is with with global warming, the access to the north is becoming a lot different for other countries. We can now have shipping lanes right through there, as opposed to 10, 20 years ago when everything was covered with ice. So part of it is to confirm our sovereignty of the north and we do that by, having a military presence there, supporting the people that live there. I think the majority of people that live in the North feel that they are Canadian, so that's a good thing. We have the Oceans Protection Plan, I think, which should be extended to cover the North to protect against any problems that we have up there with regards to disastrous shipping. And there's one project that we just got together with the Yukon government on, and it's hydroelectric plan up there, and it will the hydroelectric thing will save 240,000 tons of greenhouse gas emissions, which is the equivalent to taking 50,000 cars off the road each year. So these things are happening, and it's really, the development in the North is going to be up to the people of the North.
Thank you. Do we have another speaker? Questioner? Okay, I'll drive. This question is for the Green Party candidate. What policies does the federal government want to enact to prevent Alberta separatism and to encourage a commitment to federalism?
Well, thank you for that question. The Green Party is about unity, and we believe Alberta is part of the Canadian family. We need to understand the transition that's required in Alberta with respect to moving away from the heavily reliant fossil fuel sector, and make a long-term transition plan to capitalize on the skills, the trade skills, the technology skills, to transition into a green economy. There's so much capacity there, and we want to be able to support Alberta to continue to be part of the Canadian family. There's many things as well that we can be creative about. We've looked at the potential for abandoned wells to be converted to geothermal. There's other ways to look at how we can build and support the capacity, the human resources, and the environment in Alberta, continuing to be part of the Canadian family.
Thank you. This next question is for the Conservative Party candidate. It has been noted on many websites that the Liberal government's climate commitments constitute investment in transit, infrastructure, and renewable energy, in addition to putting a price on pollution, all in order to drive down greenhouse gas emissions. What is your stance, rather, what is your party's stance on carbon tax as a way to reduce emissions? Will there be any incentives for the purchase of electric cars should you take government?
Thank you. The Trudeau carbon tax unfairly targets average Canadians rather than the heavy emitters. It exempts up to 90% of their emissions. That's the heavy emitters' emissions. Canadian families and small businesses pay 92% of the tax burden, while industry only pays 8%. This not only misses our Paris commitments, but it also ignores the global problem, which climate change is. It's a global problem. Conservatives believe that 100% of mandated GHG expenses should be applied to technology research that reduces GHGs and can also be sold to places like India and China to address the actual global problem that we have. We have not committed to subsidizing electric vehicles. That's not on our announced plan. But we will be introducing the green tax credit. It's a 2-year plan that will encourage Canadians to improve their homes with emissions-reducing technologies, and which also, by the way, reduces their cost of living. Thank you.
Thank you. This next question is for the NDP candidate. What do you plan to do with the issues surrounding Indigenous women and girls that represent 16% of homicides and only 4% of the population?
Well, we have to fully understand and implement the calls to justice that were recommended by the Murdered and Missing Indigenous Women's Inquiry. You'll notice that similar to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, these are not recommendations. The first set were calls to action. These are calls to justice. We have to recognize that this is a deep stain on our country's history. we have to recognize the pathways that have led to this. We have the historical, multi-generational, intergenerational trauma that's existed. There's social and economic marginalization. Our country has maintained the status quo for so many years, and we have ignored the agency and expertise of Indigenous women. For me personally, I have met with a number of Cowichan Tribes members who themselves are pursuing this issue locally, and I have tried to make my office's resources available to them so that they will have the resources to talk locally about it, because it's an issue which is affecting us here right at home, but their interest is also that we expand it to also include murdered and missing men, because many families are suffering from the loss of a loved one. This is a trauma that causes so much incredible pain to families, and I think it's time that we turn the page and start ourselves on a new future.
Thank you. We're down to the last two preset questions. This would be for the Liberal Party candidate. How would your party handle the fact that the government owns the pipeline and is no longer part of the free market?
Thanks for that question. First of all, let's look at how we got here. The TMX pipeline through Kinder Morgan has been on the table for quite a while. They have invested millions of dollars and a pile of time in trying to get approvals to get this pipeline through to Tidewater. And it got to a point recently where they had just given up, really, and threw their hands in the air and said, you know, we can't do this anymore because there's too much political interference in what we're trying to do. So the government stepped in and purchased the pipeline for a couple of reasons. One, to protect our reputation in the world as a place where you can invest money without having undue political influence, overriding reasonable decisions. Now, we've gotten this thing to a point where we went back and re-engaged the Aboriginal community as the courts had requested, and we are again at a point where we can start building this pipeline. At some point,
10 seconds.
fairly quickly, we are going to be returning that pipeline to the private sector. The government does not want to own a pipeline, and it'll either be purchased by somebody or it'll be a public company will be set up to take it over.
Thank you. Finally, to our Green Party candidate. What are your short and long-term plans for eradicating single-use plastics? If you don't have a plan, then why not?
Thanks for the question. The Green definitely have a plan. As part of our environment and climate change policy, to create a comprehensive national strategy on plastic pollution and to have it implemented over the course of 10 years. We need to establish a plastics life cycle advisory group with representatives from industry, science, governments, and civil society to make recommendations for better standards and hard targets for us to hit. It's time that we adopt a precautionary approach to limit the production and use of persistent, harmful contaminants in plastics. When I was taking environmental law more than 2 decades ago, we talked about cradle to grave. Now we should talk about cradle to cradle.
Thank you. So we now move to the next phase of our meeting together. There are questions in your heads. Maybe you've been thinking about them for years, and maybe you've been thinking about them for 20 minutes. Either way, this is your chance. We would invite any of our guests and our students to come and line up perhaps no more than 4 or 5 at a time behind each of these 2 microphones, and what we'll do is we'll alternate back and forth. We'd ask that A, you be clear about who you are asking the question of, and B, that you keep it tight. 30 seconds, please. Keep it clear and concise so that the candidates can do their very best to answer the questions. Remember, they haven't been prepared for some of what you may ask them. This is the hard part. Go ahead. I'll give you a second to assemble your rows. For those of you that are not coming to the stage and asking a question, you're being a really great audience. Please continue by allowing it to be quiet enough so that it can be heard across the space. That means you're not really talking. We'll start on this side. Go ahead, Kalila.
This is for the NDP candidate. I would like to know, with the possible implementation of the pipeline, how will you advocate for our BC waterways with special mind of the orcas and their patterns of speech and how tankers would affect this?
Thank you for the question. My intention is to not let that pipeline expand at all. I think there is absolutely zero economic business case for it any longer, given that we have pipelines that are going down to the United States. And furthermore, if you look at the Port Metro Vancouver's intentions to rapidly expand its operations, the number of freighters which are coming there and also using the anchorages which are in and amongst the southern Gulf Islands, if we start a 7-fold increase in tanker traffic through the Burrard Inlet with Port Metro Vancouver's expansion plans, then we know the southern resident killer whale population is not going to have a very bright future. You add to that the danger of an oil spill, diluted bitumen in our waterways would absolutely terrorize our coastline. It's impossible to clean up, it sinks. So my intention is to not let that pipeline expand, but also put ourselves on a future, on a pathway to where we don't need fossil fuels.
Thank you.
Lucas, go ahead.
Thank you all for being here. This is directed towards the Conservative candidate. Even though they're not represented here today, how do you feel that Maxime Bernier and the People's Party of Canada have a chance of swaying your traditional voter base to vote for their party, and as such turning some of your strong conservative stronghold ridings orange or red? And if so, what are your party's plans to perhaps avoid this changing the tides? Thank you.
Strange question. I can't say that I've had it at the door yet, but I was quite upset, I guess you could say, when Bernier decided to form his own party. He was very aware of the damage that has been done by our current government, the damage that's been done by Trudeau, and the damage that he would do over another 4-year term. And yet he created a new party that would essentially put him in, that would try to put Trudeau into power another 4 years. And but it turns out that it's not turned into such a threat as what we expected. And there are some, I guess, some advantages to it in that the extreme right, which was trying to join our party, is now tending to try to join his. So there are some advantages. Thank you.
Thank you.
This is a question for the Liberal Party. What are some methods that the Liberal Party is taking to regain the trust of the Canadians after the SNC-Lavalin scandal?
Thanks for the question. First of all, I was not in Ottawa when this was happening, so I don't have intimate knowledge on it. There is I guess we have to look at whether it is a reasonable thing for the Prime Minister to say to the Attorney General at some point, here we have 2 different streams that we can follow. We would like you to have a closer look at this one, and whether that's a reasonable request or not. Personally, I think it is. But all I would say right now is that on the SNC file, the SNC is going to court through the criminal conviction route, and nothing changed with the undue influence as they suggest. So it is going that route. There's some issues with going that way because my fear is that once it gets to court, that a judge could throw it out based on all the information that has been floating around in the media.
10 seconds.
And that would be a worst case scenario. The deferred prosecution agreement is not a get out of jail free card. It is a huge fines and controls on the company, and it has been out in the press as a get out of jail free card, and it's just not factual.
Thank you.
Lawrence, go ahead.
Hello, I have a question for the Conservative candidate. In your introduction, you talked about how the government is spending the money, taxpayer money, unwisely, and that they're asking for too much tax money, and that as Conservatives you propose to lower the amount of taxes. How do you believe that lowering taxes will affect the way that the government spends their money?
They will be then, the government that is lowering their taxes will be actually dealing with the problem of a growing need for taxes. I mean, it is a very complex situation in that, that we not only have to reduce taxes, but we've also got to get the economy going on all 4 cylinders or 6 cylinders or 8 cylinders. So, you know, part of it is just getting the economy going again, which actually ends up with more taxes coming in. And as long as we're cutting, as long as people have more money in their pockets to spend, they are going to be spending it on things that, again, create more income for the government. Did I answer your question properly? I'm not sure I really got to it, but.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I'll just, I can rephrase it just as because if there's less tax money coming in, how do you propose that the government will, because of that, change the ways that they'll spend their money?
Oh, you actually have to put pressure on the government to cut budgets. It's Ralph Klein used to talk about how, you know, he'd you know, bang his fist on the table, and the departments would say, okay, well, we're going to have to shut the swimming pools down, simply because the swimming pools were the most important thing to the people. And so you can't just on the surface say, okay, well, okay, we're going to cut budgets. You actually have to go into detail. You have to actually, you've actually got to look at the figures and get into the details to be able to intelligently cut back on the budgets so that we're not spending silly money.
Thank you.
Mr. Herbert has asked for a redirect on that question. Go ahead.
I have to be able to respond to that. You know, in the last 4 years, the Liberal government has created over 1 million jobs in this economy. The unemployment rate is at the lowest level in 40 years, and those things are you know, are going pretty well. I'm not sure where Alana gets her information from, but you know, we are the most robust economy in the G7. So. That's my only comment.
Thank you. Sir.
Yeah, I have a 2-part question. I'd like to hear from all 4 candidates, but if the moderator won't allow that, then
correct,
I would suggest the NDP candidate. First of all, what is your stand on the environment and climate change issues as opposed to economic issues? And the second part of that is, what would be your stand if your party caucus approves economic policy at the expense of the environment or the climate? And I can give the examples of the pipeline, LNG, and fracking and shale gas.
That was me first? Yeah. Well, it's a realization first. I mean, as I said in my intro, we have to realize that climate change is going to be the defining issue of the 21st century. We either set ourselves on course as a nation to be proactive and deal with it now, or we are going to be reacting. And I hear a lot of talk between the Conservatives and Liberals about the cost of a carbon tax. What's often not talked about is the economic devastation that will result from unmitigated climate change. I think when we're talking about in the environment in an economic sense, it's about realizing that you cannot have environmental justice without social justice and economic justice. And any successful plan to tackle climate change has to have a place in it for workers. We have to show that there are incredible opportunities in the renewable energy economy of the future. We have to show workers who are in oil and gas that we have transition plans for them, we have training plans, and that we need their transferable skills to get our country to where we need to be. This is something that is going to happen whether we like it or not. So we have to be proactive. We have to put those policies in place now because the clock is ticking.
Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Switson has asked for a redirect.
Thank you for the question. I just want to just add a little bit to what the Green Party's approach is, and really thinking about setting meaningful targets that will have an impact, that will move us forward towards a green economy. And we need to understand that we are in a climate emergency and act appropriately and work together across party lines, across civil society, to find the ways to move us forward to a green economy, eliminating fuel subsidies, doing the work that's necessary to help save our Mother Earth in terms of banning fracking, supporting electric vehicles. And I just wanted to add a little bit to some weight to the question in terms of the concrete steps we need to take.
Thank you. Go ahead.
Hi, I would like to ask this next question to Alistair McGregor from the NDP. So considering what you just said about climate change being the defining issue of this generation, and that you've made this a major part of your platform, and that your party has taken in opposition to the Trans Mountain Pipeline, I would like to know what the NDP's position is on LNG, specifically the $40 billion investment in BC. If you aren't against this, how do you reconcile this with the belief which scientists are telling us that we need to rapidly transition away from fossil fuels?
That's a great question. I think I'd first start off by pointing out that that decision did fall under provincial jurisdiction, and it's not as black and white as many would like to believe. I know that in the development of those plans, many First Nations in the north were involved. We have buy-in from the Haisla Nation, the Wet'suwet'en, and I know there's still a lot of work that has to be done with part of the Wet'suwet'en First Nation. What I can say is that going forward for the federal NDP and how we look at energy projects that fall under federal jurisdiction, we first of all realize that Justin Trudeau came to power in 2015 with a promise to eliminate fossil fuel subsidies. Those have not been done. Our promise is to get rid of those and to redirect them into energy projects that don't pollute. And I think we just have to realize that our future does not involve the expansion of fossil fuel infrastructure. That is my pledge to you. That's what our federal party pledge is. We do not believe that, given all of the climate science around us, that we can afford to continue expanding the fossil fuel industry. So no more fossil fuel subsidies, no more expansion. Instead, redirecting those resources into the renewable energy economy of the future, the one where our economic future actually lies, because we have incredible resources at our disposal, not only from wind power, from hydroelectric, from tidal power, but we have real opportunity to set ourselves to be in a great position for the end of the 21st century.
Thank
Can
you.
I respond to that?
Yes, a redirect.
I think, I think the easy answer to that question was that they can't reconcile it. This is an NDP government in BC who, with the support of the Green Party, has gone heavily into LNG. And the Green Party said, well, we're not doing that. But they could bring down the government tomorrow if they wanted to. But they don't want to, because they like the paycheck that they're getting every month. So this is one of those things that is not reconcilable and leaves them in an interesting situation, that's for sure.
Thank you. Mr. Perry.
Thank you. This is a question about taxation, and it's directed to the Conservative candidate and with a possible redirect from the Liberal. While all parties are against wasteful spending, at least they say they are, and all parties have, who have had a chance to be in government have made mistakes regarding wasteful spending, so they're on equal footing there. All parties seem to be against raising taxes, or do it reluctantly. Some would like to lower them. Mr. Scheer said on Wednesday evening that increasing taxation takes money out of the economy, but that money is still being spent within Canada
10 seconds.
by the government. Money that is taken out of the economy is taken out by the 10% super rich who are putting it in offshore accounts and in offshore investments. Would the Conservative Party be willing to increase taxes on the top 10% of Canadian earners in order to give the rest of us a break, while maintaining programs
Mr. Perry, you're out of order. That's the longest 30 seconds I will allow.
By the way, we are the only party that is committed to a 3%, continuing the 3% increase in social transfers and health transfers. But in terms of that money that's leaving the country, $100 billion of investment money has left the country in the last 2 years, more than $100 billion. And that's actually regarding what the Liberals have done to our economy. And that money needs to come back here and be invested in jobs here, good paying jobs here. Thank you.
Wouldn't have left it if they'd been taxed.
Thank you. That is out of order. Would anyone like to redirect?
That was my redirect.
I'm sorry, but you didn't raise your hand, Greg.
It wouldn't have left the country if it had been captured by the government in the form of taxes.
Alana, why don't you go ahead and answer, and then I think Mr. McGregor would like to redirect.
Yes, it might have left the country before it was taxed.
Go ahead, Alistair.
If the taxes were increased, yes.
So I believe that inequality, and it's shown by the statistics, has grown quite a bit in our country over the last number of decades. And I think that this world has far too many billionaires. Our party is proposing a tax, a 1% wealth tax on fortunes of $20 million or more, and that's how we're going to pay for a lot of our program. I think it's rather simplistic, though, to boil down a millionaire or billionaire's decision to leave the country based on taxation alone. I think a lot of the companies that do business in Canada are looking at the fact that we have a stable political climate. We have workers that have good health and safety laws. We have a healthcare system. We have communities that are quite prosperous and a citizenry that is quite educated. So there's a whole number of factors which make Canada a very attractive place to set up business, and just boiling it down to taxation rates, I think, is far too black and white.
Thank you. Because we're getting into a rather more disputatious section of the meeting, I would remind everyone that we're looking for 30-second questions and 1-minute answers. When you ask compound questions, it's really hard to answer them. So 1 question per person, please. Otherwise, you have to go to the back of the line and walk through again. Go ahead, Rico.
Hi, this question is directed towards the NDP. I was wondering, even though Canada is a very progressive country, I would say, what we haven't done yet is address the problem of transgender athletes and their placement in the athletic world and their athletic participation. So I was wondering if the NDP gets into office, or if you are sent back to Ottawa again, how you guys plan to address this issue in the long term.
Well, with the specific issue of athletes, I think that's something absolutely we need to look at, but I think that's part and parcel of the broader question of the rights of transgendered people in Canada generally. We know that as a group that identifies in different ways than what society has traditionally stated, that they still find a lot of persecution and a lot of discrimination. I'm proud to be a member of a party that has always fought for the rights of the most marginalized in our society. We were one of the first parties, we were the first party to have an openly gay politician running at the federal level. And we have stood strong with our allies in pride parades with lesbian, gay, transgendered people, and will continue to do so. I think for the sporting issue, that's just part and parcel of something that we need to recognize, that transgendered people still in Canada to this day, as much as we like to talk about how progressive we are on these issues, still face discrimination. And so that one topic, I think, is part of a larger conversation that we have to make sure that everyone, no matter what their sexual orientation or how they identify, is recognized as having full and equal partners and the respect that comes with that.
Thank you.
This question is directed towards the Conservative candidate. Both my brothers have passed through Brentwood and graduate. However, very often they'd struggle because they wouldn't be able to see my parents, and so very often my mom would have to come down here and make sure my brothers would be able to so that my brothers would be able to stay in Brentwood. However, whenever she'd try to come in, very often she'd be questioned by the customs officers that she was staying in Canada permanently without applying for residence. And she is now applying for residence in Canada, but this has taken her several years in order to just apply for it. And the Liberal Party has allowed a lot of illegal immigrants to simply jump over the border between
Let's
America.
come to a question. Ask a question. It's okay. That was great backdrop. Just give us a question.
What will the Conservative Party do to make things, will the Conservative Party take steps to make legal immigration easier for people who are trying to enter Canada legally, while also doing things that while also changing the process for illegal immigration?
Thank you very much for that question. A Conservative government will work immediately to restore the fairness, order, and compassion of our immigration system. One of the fallouts from the illegal immigration that has been coming into the country is that it has taken up so much of the resources of the department that they have essentially been backlogged on the legal immigration. And so we need to make sure that we redirect our efforts so that our fair and compassionate system actually operates again. Thank you.
Mr. Herbert has asked for a redirect on that one.
Just to clarify, we don't have an illegal immigration issue in Canada. What we do have is a refugee issue, people claiming refugee status that are coming in through the United States at our southern border. Two totally different things. We have 350,000 people as our target for next year for legal immigration, but part of that, and part of that number is for refugees. Now, we do need to get a handle on people coming across the border in the States, but it's not, those people go through a refugee process, and if they are not considered refugees, they are removed from the country. So these are not illegal immigrants, they are refugee claimants.
Thank you. Go ahead.
Hi, so my question is directed to the Green candidate. Could you talk more to your plan to remove one-time use plastic, and how do you plan to make other types of plastic, like reusable plastic, more viable to large corporations?
Thank you for the question. Well, part of, as I said earlier, putting together an advisory group that includes science and set standards that will incentivize industry to move towards a greener economy. So overall, setting good standards and targets, ensuring that as we take the steps to get the advice and the necessary information out to civil society in terms of our role, as well as government's role in setting standards to encourage over a period of time a transition right out of one-use, single-use plastics. And it's a collaborative exercise of setting, making a plan, having the 10-year plan, setting the targets, ensuring we have the experts at the table, and we get the buy-in from civil society in terms of moving in a direction that protects our Mother Earth.
Mr. McGregor has asked for a follow-up.
Yeah, single-use plastics, the plastics issue in general is a huge issue, especially as that plastic starts to break down and turn into microplastics. It's starting to make its way up the food chain, and it's severely affecting our marine life. I'm proud to be a member of a party and a caucus that has actually acted on this issue through two initiatives. My friend Gord Johns brought in a plastics motion that passed unanimously in the House of Commons. My friend Nathan Cullen sponsored a private member's bill that's actually going to amend the law. So we've actually put our words into action. And when I was as agriculture critic for my party, I sat down with the Food and Beverage Association of Canada, and I told them this change is coming, and the successful companies are going to be the ones that see the way the needle is moving, and they're going to be the ones that start to innovate now. There's exciting research going on in places like the University of Guelph, which are looking at compostable plastics. So we have the research going on. I think we have the technology. We have to make exceptions for people who rely on on straws or other medically necessary devices that are made out of plastic, but by and large, we can change it through some concerted federal action that harmonizes what every province is doing. But the federal government absolutely has jurisdiction over this issue, and we do need to act because the evidence is clear that it is severely harming our environment.
Mr. Herbert has asked for a second and final follow-up.
Just real quickly, we have, the Liberal government has committed to banning single-use plastics by 2021. And this is doable. I was actually talking to a fellow that runs a fast food restaurant in Duncan, and he was mentioning that, you know, this is going to be pretty onerous on them. And I said, if the public was to demand this from you, you would be able to do this in less than 6 months. So it's really up to the people in this room and everywhere else to demand this from the companies, and the marketplace will respond. But in spite of that, the government is working at banning single-use plastics by 2021.
Thank you. Go ahead, sir.
Good afternoon. Most appreciate this opportunity. My question is for the federal Conservative candidate. I have to say, though, that I do find it shocking that your sole response to Indigenous reconciliation is to build climate-destroying pipelines. But my question directly reflects an issue in this riding. As we know, two critical issues in the marine environment is our endangered and threatened southern resident killer whales and endangered, threatened populations of Chinook salmon. We know that open net cage salmon farms are destroying wild salmon stocks on this coast, and the unsustainable herring fishery, which is happening in the waters of this riding, are depriving both those species of a critical food source. So my question is, what specifically are you proposing to do about open net cage salmon farms and the unsustainable herring fishery?
I do believe that there is, we'll call it a difference of opinion on this in terms of the effects of the farmed salmon upon our Pacific salmon. And I do believe that the research, no matter how deeply we look into it, is that they have not been harming the Pacific salmon. And but I do believe that we might have to just disagree. We'd have to agree to disagree on that. And the farmed salmon is something that the Indigenous have been backing quite strongly for their economic development. And I don't know why we should be penalizing them for that. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. McGregor has asked for a redirect, followed by Ms. Whitson in a second and final redirect.
So your question is bang on. I very much agree with the premise you're posing. My friend and colleague Finn Donnelly, the Member of Parliament, I think it's Port Moody Coquitlam, he has for several years been championing the issue of moving from open net fish farms to closed containment systems on land. And in fact, he brought in a legislative initiative to do just that would establish a transition plan for the industry. And unfortunately, that was voted down by Liberals and Conservatives. When it comes to the issue of the herring fishery, I'm not as familiar with that, but definitely with the Chinook one, I think that here locally we have to recognize the strong conservation efforts and habitat restoration measures that are going on by sport fishermen. We have to make sure that when we're going out and catching Chinook salmon, maybe an exemption can be made for hatchery-raised fish, but definitely the wild populations have to be given as much help as possible, not only to make their way to their spawning grounds, but also because they are that important food source for the southern resident killer whale population. So I very much agree with you on that.
Thank you. Ms. Whitson.
Thank you. The Green Party would support a ban of open pen fish farming in the ocean and move towards a closed containment. The Indigenous peoples, my colleague was referring to up island that I'm aware of, they are doing closed containment farming. Fish farming, which we're mitigating against the impact and the significant impact that we've seen open pen really impact and really in some ways poison our natural stocks. And so in addition, when we talk about the herring fishery, we know that the Supreme Court of Canada has recognized an Indigenous people's right to access that herring, and I suggest that we have not gone far enough to even bring the Indigenous worldview into ensuring that Indigenous knowledge, traditional knowledge, and local champions actually have a voice in making sure that we protect our oceans and the species that we all rely on.
Thank you. So these issues are obviously quite tentacular and have lots of different parameters, and I'm sure all the speakers and candidates would like to answer all of these questions, but to maintain decorum, move forward, and Robert's rules, we're only going to allow 2 redirects, because I said so. Thank you.
Thank you. Although I would love for any willing redirects, I'd like to initially point my question towards the Green Party candidate. Amongst other candidates, you and others have expressed your interest in reusable plastics as a solution to single-use plastics, and I would just like to know you or your party's approach in addressing the recycling crisis in Canada that is affected by the fact that all recycling industries are part of the private sector and thus are profit-seeking. How do you suggest that we deal with the single-use plastics that haven't been or nor will be recycled currently?
Well, it certainly created a backlog that we know we need to deal with in terms of the impacts on our environment. The Green Party would set reusable and refillable packaging targets for food distributors and for fast food distributors. We'd ban production and distribution and sale of all non-essential petroleum-based single-use plastics and extend that ban on microbeads as well to include household industrial products that that also have impacts on our environment. So in terms of dealing with the backlog, we need to ensure that in terms of the recycling, our commitment to recycling, and also that the policies we set are effectively turning those products into something that is reusable so that we can minimize the single-use plastics.
Thank you. Mr. McGregor would like a redirect, followed by Mr. Long.
Yeah, I think for far too long, our approach to recycling has been to put the onus on the individual, right? You know, it's sort of a feel-good measure. If you just put out your blue bin and sort out your recyclables, it'll be taken care of. Unfortunately, a shocking number of those recyclables that we're putting out on the curbside are actually making their way into the garbage because they don't have the technology to actually sort through it properly. And so what we want to do as New Democrats is to take that onus from the individual and put it back on the company that is actually selling you the product in the first place through their packaging, how they make it. I think that if we make companies that are making their products more responsible for the life cycle of that product, and we start going from a waste economy where it's traveling in a linear direction to a more circular economy, that's how we tackle this problem appropriately. To your question about private companies doing the recycling, I mean, I think that's more under the jurisdiction of regional governments and municipalities, but of course I think the major goal is to make their job easier by starting at the source from the packaging and the company that's making the product in the first place.
Thank you. Ms. Long?
I urge you not to discount the value of our recycling. I actually live on Thetis Island, which is the northern part of this riding, and we're very proud of our recycling. It's because we actually do sort it at the point, and our recycling is actually very valuable. We actually sell all our recycled products. And so I please, there is more work that needs to be done on this. There's work that needs to be done between provinces to standardize, and there's a lot more research that needs to be done, but please don't give up on recycling. Thank you.
Thank you. Go ahead, sir.
This question is for the Liberal candidate. As of last year, Bill C-16 was brought forward, and basically what it is, it stops discrimination with pronouns, and it's a law. My question is, do you think the government should create laws and tell people what to say? Do you think that's limiting free speech? And what about
That's one
older
question.
people?
Thank you. We'll just leave it right
All
there.
right.
That's a good question. Let's leave it with the period. Go ahead, sir.
Yeah, thanks for that. First of all, you know, I'm at a bit of a disadvantage here because I don't know any more about C-16 than most of the people in this room, I think. I have not spent a lot of time in Ottawa. I have spent no time in the House of Commons, so I'm not really able to respond. But do I think that it's the government's place to tell people what to say? No, I'm not a believer of that. But I just specifically, I have legislation thrown up to me all the time on the doorstep, and I get a chance to go and have a look at it. I'll have a look at C-16 this afternoon, but at this point, I'm not sure what to tell you.
Thank you. I appreciate those of you standing and waiting. We're going to allow a redirect from Mr. McGregor.
So I believe the question is about gender identity and discrimination on that.
Yes, sir.
I believe if you look on the jurisprudence on this issue, the courts have clearly ruled in many cases that there are justifiable limits to free speech if it is promoting hatred against an identifiable group. And if you allow me to finish, I think it's really important when you look at the discrimination that trans people continue to face in this country. Their right to identify as either male or female or intersex, I think, is really important. And that I think I will side along with the courts on this issue, that I don't want to take away a person's right to free speech. But if it is in any way contributing to hate or some kind of discrimination towards an identifiable group, I think that's where we have to put the brakes on and really tread very cautiously, because these people are already feeling very marginalized, and I have the interest of creating a safe place, a safe society where they can feel full inclusion.
Thank you.
Can I just? Okay.
Sorry, no. Go ahead. That was a great question.
Hi, my question is for the Conservative Party. You talked about earlier cutting the greenhouse tax in Canada, but then you also talked about being more progressive and putting more pressure on other countries to step in with the climate change. But how would getting rid of our greenhouse tax really benefit that?
Did you hear that? Because I had trouble.
I didn't, sorry.
A little closer to the mic. He's a tall fella, so bring yourself to the microphone and ask it again.
This question's for the Conservative Party. You talked about being more progressive and, can't forget my word now, but you were talking about putting more pressure on other countries to step up and help with climate change, but then you also brought up the point in the introduction where you talk about cutting or getting rid of the greenhouse tax in Canada. How would that really help with climate change?
Well, the point is that the Trudeau carbon tax does not help the problem. That what we really need to do is reduce the world's greenhouse gases. We only produce 1.6% of the world's greenhouse gases. The big guys, the Indias and Chinas, whose greenhouse gases are increasing at an enormous rate, they could be helped by our technology. And that's why we need to essentially charge the emitters that are producing most of the greenhouse gas. We need to be charging them, but not just taking their not just taxing them, taking that money and redirecting it to technology research to reduce greenhouse gases, and then get that technology to the parts of the world that are really causing the greenhouse gases. Thank you.
Go ahead. Redirection from Mr. Herbert.
First of all, with the carbon tax, I'm sure most of the people in the room know that this year in 2018 Nobel Prize for Economics was given to somebody for their research on carbon tax, saying that it was the most efficient way to get the population basically to change the way they are doing things. Now, this is a revenue neutral tax. It upsets me when the Conservatives keep talking about taking money out of people's pockets. This money is coming back to the people. It's a revenue neutral tax. And it is not being imposed in BC because we already have our own tax. But in other places in the country, Saskatchewan as an example, they are charging the carbon tax, and each person is getting about a $600 check directly from the federal government. Originally, it was supposed to go to the provincial government, but they refused to take the money. So the federal government is sending it out to each of the people in those provinces. So it's clear that if we need leadership in this country on the climate file, it's going to come from Canada, out of North America anyway, because the Americans aren't doing anything on it either. And but what we're doing is the most efficient system on trying to get people to change their behavior.
Thank you. Ms. Whitson?
Thank you for the question. I just wanted to add that the Green Party, with respect to carbon pricing, that we need to maintain a broad-based, revenue-neutral carbon fee on all sources of carbon dioxide pollution, with dividends that do return to Canadians. Fighting climate change is an environmental and a natural resource issue, and we need to continue to ensure that we use the carbon pricing and the tools that we need to in order to reduce to the targets that we set for the Green Party and for Canada.
Thank you. Go ahead.
Hi, I'd like to direct my question to the NDP candidate. How and when do you propose to implement new jobs for those lost in the oil and gas sector in Alberta, as you plan to completely move away from fossil fuels and into renewable energy?
Sure. So I think, first of all, we have to realize that the jobs in the oil sector are not going to just disappear overnight. What we're talking about is a transition plan. So stopping any expansion, but you have to understand that the workers who are currently there are still going to have jobs. But we have to arrive at a place where we are achieving net carbon zero emissions at some point. Our climate is demanding it, and the economic costs of doing nothing are going to far outweigh any costs of the transition. I think when you look at our platform document, we have a real plan, because a lot of those jobs, if you look at the skill sets, a lot of the people who work in the oil patch are electricians, they're heavy-duty mechanics, they're pipe fitters. They have a lot of very specific and technical skills which are going to be needed in the renewable energy economy of the future. You know, I've looked at propositions which look at British Columbia and Alberta working together, where Alberta, with its massive wind potential, can actually act as an anchor for British Columbia, and British Columbia has its hydroelectric dams in existence. The two can work together so that we have some sort of a national energy grid. Those skills will be in demand, and we do have a plan to use them.
Thank you. Go ahead.
Thank you. Under your plan, or my question is directed to the Conservative candidate. Under your plan to reduce taxes and cut federal budgets, what areas of federal funding does your party plan on cutting, and why do you believe that these areas are disposable enough to reduce their funding?
Sorry, there it is, right there. Okay, here's a beginning list of what we'll cut. First of all, corporate welfare. We do not believe in corporate welfare and payments to big corporations like Loblaws, who got the $12 million. One of the things is the $250 million of the Asian Infrastructure Bank to build roads and bridges overseas. The $15,000 for Trudeau's vacation to the Bahamas. $200 for a giant rubber duck. $155,000 for a red leather couch. $17,000 to bring a personal chef on Trudeau's trip to India. Those, you know, that's just the beginning. Thank you.
Thank you.
Redirect from Mr. Herbert. Go ahead, sir.
I just have to comment on some of this stuff. First of all, like the $12 million to Loblaws, that was under an environmental program where we established a fund for $2 billion to basically upgrade equipment in the country. Now, this is about a $50 million expenditure for Loblaws, of which $12 million is coming from the federal government. To put this out and say that the only people that can qualify for this grant are companies that are not successful and do not have any profit is ridiculous, because then we would have no uptake on this thing. Right? You can't penalize Loblaws because they are actually making money. What we have been able to do with the $12 million that we have put out there is we have been able to move this project ahead by probably 5 to 10 years. It takes, again, the equivalent of about 50,000 vehicles off the road and is worthwhile for the people. I just have to comment real briefly on
10
this
seconds.
Asian or Chinese bank or whatever that the Conservatives keep harping on about. Canada has a 1% stake in that operation. It is not a Chinese bank. It is headquartered in Beijing. But there's like 57 different countries or more than that involved in this thing. And the rhetoric is beginning to drive me nuts, to tell you the truth.
Thank you. I regret to tell you, although some of us feel like we could do this all day because politics is fun, the amount of energy these four candidates are pouring out is going to run dry at some point, justifiably. And so we're in our last 5 minutes. I'd ask that maybe we're down to, or maybe our last 3 questions, and we'll start with Mr. Rodriguez here on our right.
Okay. So this question is directed at the NDP candidate. And with consideration to the NDP's federal plan to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and reduce reliance on fossil fuels, can you comment on whether or not you as a party intend to support development in nuclear energy as an alternative, and whether or not you will invest in research in developing cleaner nuclear tech so that it's more viable as an alternative to fossil fuels in the energy sector?
Well, nuclear, I know there's a lot of potential there. I think when I listen to my colleagues who live close by the nuclear plants in Ontario, I'm thinking of my colleagues Brian Mass, there's a real problem with where you put the waste. And in many Ontario communities, there's been a huge argument as to where they're trucking this, where they're storing it, and how well the containment systems will work, because of course that waste is going to remain radioactive for years and years to come. I have been reading up on new emerging technologies in the nuclear field, and I would like to keep an open mind. I think that given the climate crisis that is before us, if nuclear can demonstrate some way of reducing or eliminating the radioactive waste, or even recycling it in some way, then I'd be open to it. But I have to take into account that that is a major problem. I know it's a fossil-free fuel and it does not emit any carbon into the atmosphere, but the waste is a major problem, and I've been informed on this subject by the experiences of local members of parliament in the Ontario region whose communities have had to deal with that waste. So that's one major part that makes me hesitant towards it. At the same time, I think we need to keep an open mind on all the full spectrum of alternative energy resources, given the seriousness of the climate issue that's before us.
Thank you. Yeah. Over here, sir.
This question is for the Liberal candidate. I would like to ask, since the Liberal government has arguably done damage on Canadian unity, what do you think are the steps necessary to regain this unity in Canada, specifically on Alberta?
With the issue of separation in Alberta, I think first of all it's a small percentage of the people that are getting a lot of attention through the media, but it's all economically driven, right? The Alberta people are concerned that they're not going to be able to get this pipeline through to Tidewater, and they are running at a huge disadvantage, as is the Canadian government. If we can get this pipeline through, the producers will be able to take in another $73 billion of in money over the next 20 years. The federal government will be able to take in about $50 billion in revenues over that same period of time. So we're talking about, and I feel the frustration from people in Alberta that we can't seem to get this thing through. But that is sort of what is at the basis of the problem. So if we are able to solve that problem, I think the winds of separation will go away.
All right, and finally, last question to you, sir.
This question's for the Conservative candidate. How do you plan on dealing with the housing crisis in Vancouver?
Nice, tight question.
I'll try to give a tight answer. The housing in Vancouver has pretty well stalled because of regulation. And one of the things that we want to do as a government is to essentially to talk them down a bit, and to get the fees down so that we actually can get more housing built in Vancouver. that's the biggest problem there, is that nothing's getting built, or very, very little is getting built. And so that's what needs to be done. Thank you.
Mr. Herbert and then Mr. McGregor would like a redirect. In fact, seeing it's the last question, why don't you all have a go? Ms. Whitson will be at the end.
One of the issues that has contributed hugely to the housing crisis in Vancouver and in BC in general is that the Conservative government about 15 years ago got out of the housing business, right? They spent no money on housing over their mandate, and left us fairly low. So when we got into government in 2015, we've established a housing act and put I don't know the exact amount of money, but it's a lot of money into it to help municipalities and help nonprofit groups and that sort of thing build affordable housing across the country. This is not a program, though, that can then fix the problem in a year. It's going to take a little bit longer than that because the Conservatives did nothing for a long period of time.
Mr. McGregor.
Well, here on Vancouver Island, of course, the housing crisis in Vancouver is starting to affect us because we're getting a lot of people that are starting to be chased out of the Vancouver market and are coming to places like Victoria and Nanaimo, and now they're discovering the beauty of the Cowichan region. So our housing prices are in fact starting to rise because we're getting what I like to call the Vancouver refugees, the ones that have been chased out of that market, but then are pumping up our prices here. One of the things that I would like to see is an end to the speculation that uses someone's piece of property as basically an investment tool. And a lot of the money that's been coming in from overseas has been basically treating the housing market like short-term capital gains. You know, you put your money into a housing property and you can watch it rise by $100,000 in a matter of months, and then you flip it. And this kind of quick selling just inflates the market and chases people out of that city. You know, I think Vancouver is suffering from a fact where the people who are needed to service the city can't even afford to live in it and are now facing commutes of an hour and a half or 2 hours just to get to work each way.
Ms. Whitson.
Thank you for the question. I know my son and his partner were in Vancouver going to university, and they really struggled just in terms of even access to housing, reasonable housing, and we know that there's a crisis in Vancouver. At the same time, what we need to do, I think, is from the Green Party's perspective, is start looking at alternatives approaches. Like, what about cooperative housing? What about other models that we can bring forward as opposed to a standard model that we have now? I think even looking to CMHC in terms of their role nationally to look at what are the how can we revisit or visit their mandate to expand beyond just a mortgage providing mortgages, but looking at actually contributing to developing a strategy across the country, focusing on where there's the highest stress.
Thank you. So, folks, well done. This has taken us to the end of the formal session of our meeting. And just before we applaud our 4 candidates for the extraordinary amount of effort they've just put out, I'd like to do a little bit of formality here, and that's that we make sure that those of you who are still waiting in the aisles perhaps to answer a question, rather than having you mobbed here on stage, perhaps it makes more sense for you to come up to the tables that have been set up in the front where you can entertain their questions at your leisure. It's lunchtime for the bulk of us. Please be respectful of your questions. I'm not there to moderate, but remember, they're just people too, and they're doing their best. We'd also like to invite you 4, if you'd like to stay for lunch, keeping in mind there's probably many who'd like to ask you more questions. I'd get out at Dodge if I could. But because of what's just occurred for the last 90 minutes, and because of our great gratitude for what you've done here today in representing your party and your thoughts personally within the party, we really thank you. Let's gather our hands together. Students, you are dismissed. Gather up in the lobby if you have more questions or comments for your candidates.